Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer here doing a week 4 cash game lineup review. I'm a little bit under the weather this week, so I'm recording this a little bit later than usual, and as a result, we flipped our projections already to week 5, so I won't be referencing our projections at dailyroto.com. In this video, you'll have to take my word for it that I played largely what the projections were dictating, but those will return for week 5's cash game lineup review. So let's start with Fanduel, where I created 2 cash game lineups. I'll look at both in $25 50-50 games. The first one was my best lineup of the week in cash games on Fanduel. This was a top 1% outcome with Deshaun Watson, Ezekiel Elliott, Gio Bernard, Kenny Golladay, Jarvis Landry, Sterling Shepard, Jared Cook, Alvin Kamara, and the Green Bay Packers. Now on Fanduel, I had a lot of similarities with the lineups. I had Deshaun Watson, Giovanni Bernard, Alvin Kamara, and Green Bay Packers in both lineups. But that's only 4 of the 9 players that were the same. The other 5 players, and it's weird to have a 2 lineup set that is a 5 versus 5, but they were really like coin tosses at 2 positions. So it was Ezekiel Elliott versus Saquon Barkley, and then it was Jared Cook versus Eric Ebron. And those players were priced very similarly as well. So it created similar lineup builds. And then the difference was really what I decided to do at wide receiver. And there were a bunch of wide receiver values that we had kind of bunched relatively closely together. At the very high end of the pricing, we had Michael Thomas and Odell Beckham. At the very low end of the pricing, we had Antonio Callaway. We had Taylor Gabriel. We had Corey Davis. I was a little bit nervous about Gabriel and Corey Davis from a cash game perspective on FanDuel because of the touchdown equity. But those guys ended up performing really well. And then we had some guys in the mid-tier, Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard, Jarvis Landry. They all kind of made my list. So basically what I was trying to accomplish with my FanDuel lineups was I was playing Deshaun Watson at quarterback. He was just underpriced. I was a little bit nervous coming into the week about the way Indy's defenses held up early in the season, but they were ravaged by injuries this week, losing top cornerback Quincy Wilson. And then also had some other injuries to the defensive line and the linebacker core that made me get more confident. And the Vegas total kind of rose during the course of the week. Houston got some steam during the course of the week, so felt a lot better about that. Gio Bernard was going to use on all my lineups this week. Just a great matchup with Atlanta, who gives up a lot of volume to pass-catching running backs and no competition for touches with Mark Walton behind him and only 2 running backs active on the depth chart. Alvin Kamara, impossible fade for me in cash games this week. He got there late a little bit, but without Mark Ingram, the volume is just so valuable. And there weren't a lot of other top players to really compete with Alvin Kamara this week. No Todd Gurley on the main slate, no Antonio Brown on the main slate. So you just kind of thinned out the pool of players a little bit. You had 2 teams on bye as well, no Chiefs on the main slate, so you had a lot of room to spend this week. And then the Packers, they were our number 1 rated defense. They were the same price as the Bears on FanDuel. I actually debated that for a second, but then I realized I was going to play the Bears defense in all my DraftKings lineups, so this was kind of a natural way to get some equity here. And obviously, Buffalo with Josh Allen, very sack prone, very turnover prone, a great matchup at home for Green Bay to bounce back. Felt pretty good about Green Bay. I think the Jaguars might have slightly outprojected them, but Green Bay was our first or second rated defense overall. The Bears were I believe, number 3. So being able to get these defenses at relatively affordable prices also made it so that you can spend up. If you look at the other lineup I created, so this lineup cashed easily, doubled up in all contests. If you look at the other lineup, about a 40-point difference here, and this was in the 35th percentile, so got across the cash line, but it was a little bit of a struggle to get so. And the big difference here, Barkley to Zeke gave up about 13 points, and Ebron to Cook gave up about 15 points. So that's right there is about 28 of the 40 points on just a 2v2 with players priced pretty similarly. In terms of the wide receiver differences, I did use Antonio Callaway, who's pretty chalky at 46% here at 4,500 bare minimum. Geronimo Allison with Randall Cobb out, thought he'd get a more substantial share of the targets, and he left the game early with a concussion, but had 6 for 80, I believe, through the third quarter. Didn't play a lot in the fourth quarter. And then Odell Beckham, who we had projecting similarly to Michael Thomas among the top tier wide receivers. The guy you ended up wanting here was DeAndre Hopkins, who had a big game when Will Fuller went down. But Beckham just disappointing in the sense that couldn't break off any big plays against that Saints secondary that's allowed so many this year, and Sterling Shepard kind of got the bulk of them. But you could see I was taking a tactical approach at making sure I had exposure against that Saints defense with having Barkley and Odell here and then having Shepard in the other lineup. So a 5 versus 5 difference in the lineups, but really fractional differences for me between the running back decision between Saquon and Zeke, the tight end position between Ebron and Cook, and then rotating some of these wide receivers that were at top values here. The strength, the core guys that I had, Watson, Bernard, Kamara, and the Packers D, were all so strong that I could miss a little bit on these secondary guys and still get across the cash line. So cashed all my double ups and 50-50s on FanDuel this weekend and won a very high percentage of head-to-heads as well. So a good cash game lineup weekend for me over on FanDuel. Let's look at DraftKings, where I used 3 lineups this week. I'll start with the highest scoring one. And the difference on DraftKings, a little bit more concentrated pool of players, because I ran 3 lineups this week, but all 3 of them had Bears, Kamara, Ebron, Shepard, and Giovanni Bernard. So 5 of the 9 players were all exactly the same on DraftKings. The differences were I created 2 Drew Brees lineups and 1 Andy Dalton lineup. And obviously the Dalton lineup, that was a 20-point difference between the 2. I was very confident in Drew Brees this week. I know some people will talk about like the home road splits with Drew Brees, and that's not something that I worry too much about. I mean, Vegas had the Saints with a 27.5 implied total, one of the highest on the slate. So, Vegas didn't see a big reason to discount the Saints' offensive productivity. I wasn't going to either. And the reason most weeks I'll usually opt for the cheaper quarterback. It allows me to build more through the skill position players. But on this week in particular, I didn't feel the need. I felt like there were so many good receiving values between the 3 and let's say 5K range that, and Ebron was 3,600 at tight end. I was going to play him. The Bears were 2,600. I was going to play him and them. And Gio was 6,300 or something like that. I was going to play them. So the only spend I had was Kamara, and I didn't really have my eyes on other guys. So the $1,200 difference between Dalton and Brees was not getting me the type of offensive upgrades that I'm usually accustomed to. So I was more willing to pay for Brees. Ultimately, the Dalton lineup was the best, and the reason being is a 20-point difference between the quarterbacks. But the guys that I locked in, again, all performed. Bernard, Shepard, Ebron, Kamara, Bears. Everyone performed exactly the way you'd want them to when they're your kind of core guys to build around. The receivers, Allison, Boyd, Shepard. I had Shepard in all 3. I had Boyd in 2 of the 3. I had Allison in 2 of the 3. So, Allison a little bit disappointing compared to the other guys, but I mean, 14 for 46 or 4,700. I'll take that every day of the week. The running back 3 decision was an area that I mixed around. I used Melvin Gordon, I used Ezekiel Elliott, and I used Tevin Coleman. The Tevin Coleman lineup was the one that ended up being really disappointing. But you can see this lineup was well across the cash line, top 4,000 cash here. This was in the top 700. This one was in the top 2,200. And the difference between the last lineup and this one is Drew Brees versus Andy Dalton, Ezekiel Elliott versus Melvin Gordon, and Taylor Gabriel versus Tyler Boyd. Only differences. So 3 versus 3 there. This lineup, even though Drew Brees tried to sink it, Taylor Gabriel kept it afloat with his big day. We were very optimistic on Taylor Gabriel, had 20% plus market share of the targets the last few weeks. In addition, the Bears were without Anthony Miller. The matchup with the Bucs defense was very favorable, and we had noticed that the Bears were kind of using Taylor Gabriel in a similar fashion to how the Chiefs had used Tyreek Hill in the past, where they'd get him the ball out on these kind of screens or jet sweeps or different easy touches where you get like a nice floor built in from receptions, but also taking some shots down the field with him, which brings the upside. And the combination was on display in Sunday's game. So we go from tie freak to perhaps Tay freak in week 4, and it was a big performance at low ownership that helped get across a line that with Drew Brees maybe wouldn't have gotten across in most other weeks. And those 2 lineups were great. They wildly outperformed the third lineup. The third lineup was a big dud at 178, which is just strange to say. It's a weird NFL year when 178 is a dud lineup, but it is what it is. Drew Brees and Tevin Coleman and Allen Robinson versus the Drew Brees lineup. It's Tevin Coleman and Alvin Robinson versus Ezekiel Elliott and Taylor Gabriel. And that's the only difference, a 2v2 there. And it's just a big difference in equity. Or maybe Tyler Boyd over Jerome Miles, I'm sorry. So maybe a 3 versus 3 there. And this one just didn't come across the line. The cash line in this contest ended up being... trying to scroll down for it now. Cash line in this contest ended up being at 205.08 maybe, it looks like. So this was well below the cash line at 28 points. And obviously Dalton versus Breeze is 20 points right there. And then Tevin Coleman versus any of the running back threes that people used, whether it was Melvin Gordon, Saquon Barkley, or Ezekiel Elliott. Big difference given up there. So, cash 2 of the 3 lineups. Ultimately, this third lineup was probably the one that was on the cutting board, so probably left a little bit of equity on the table by going to this third lineup. I just really liked Tevin Coleman this week. I really thought there was a lot of room for opportunity to improve against the Cincinnati run defense that had gotten bowled over by Christian McCaffrey and a Panthers offense with missing 3 offensive linemen. And ultimately, Ito Smith got the rushing touchdown. Ito Smith was more involved than I think any Tevin Coleman owner would want to see, and it ended up being a disappointing performance. So this is a week. There's certainly going to be some weeks when you play multiple cash game lineups where hedging helps you, and this is probably a week where it hurt me a little bit because this was my last lineup iteration, and it was a little bit of a force for me trying to get Tevin Coleman and Allen Robinson exposure that I wanted. Had a bunch of exposure to those guys in GPPs. Maybe not the right week in cash just because the value at wide receivers were so strong. So maybe a little bit of a force there from me, especially when you could have gotten a true bell cow back in the 8Ks or high 7s with Zeke up here. So a little bit of regrets on that cash game split, but that'll do it for week 4's cash game lineup review. Hope to be back for week 5 with a look at our projections as well in retrospect. And best of luck to everybody in their games in week 5.